A lot of people think the AI question is, which one is the smartest? I don't think that's the real question. I think the real question is, are you paying for the right version for the kind of work you actually do? Because from the outside, ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini can look weirdly similar. You open a browser, type a prompt, hit enter, get an answer. Sure, on the surface, that all looks basically the same. It's kind of like Windows. Yeah, it's all Windows, but Windows Starter and Windows Pro are not even remotely the same thing. One is there so your laptop can technically function, the other is built for actual work. And honestly, that is basically what's happening in AI right now. These companies are not building the same product. They're making very different bets about what intelligence should feel like, what the product should become, and who it is really for. Claude is more controlled. Gemini is way more obsessed with multimodality and giant context. And ChatGPT, even though it's still the default pick in a lot of people's minds, is trying to be the broadest all-around system. So today, I don't want to do the usual feature checklist. I want to go one level deeper, not just what each one does, but which version makes sense for which person. Because once you see that, you also start to see why so many people are paying for the wrong one. If you've ever thought, honestly, all these AIs kind of sound the same, there's a very good chance you've mostly been using the free version. And yeah, that matters. A lot. Back in the day, Windows Starter looked like Windows. Sure, but the second you tried to do anything serious, you realized you were not using the real thing. That is exactly what most AI free tiers feel like now. They are usable. I'm not saying they're useless. For light stuff, they're fine. Cleaning up an email, summarizing an article, explaining something basic, maybe helping you rewrite a paragraph. Sure, that's enough. But the moment you want AI to become an actual work tool, not a toy, not a demo, not something you open once in a while, the gap starts showing up fast. Longer chats, better speed, better tools, better file handling, more consistency, less of that weird feeling where the model suddenly gets dumber right when you needed it not to. And that's usually the point where the money conversation starts. Now, pricing changes, and it can vary a lot by country, so always check the current plan page before you subscribe. But the structure is pretty clear. All three companies are pushing people into paid tiers. In the US right now, ChatGPT's consumer paid plans start at $20 a month for Plus and then jump all the way to $200 for Pro. Claude starts at $20 a month too, or about $17 a month if you pay annually, and then Max moves into the much heavier user tier. Google comes in lower on the first rung, with AI Plus below that usual $20 line, AI Pro sitting right around it, and Ultra much higher. So no, free tier is not where I judge the real product. If I had to say it simply, free tier is for light users, casual questions, occasional help, low-stakes stuff. It is not the version I would use to decide what these models are actually capable of. Before you subscribe to ChatGPT Plus, I think there's one thing you need to understand. You are not just buying features, you're buying into a product philosophy. Back in the Windows era, Home Premium was the sweet spot, not the stripped-down version, not the enterprise monster either, just the version that unlocked most of what normal people actually wanted. That's basically ChatGPT Plus. If I had to describe it in one line, I'd say this: ChatGPT still feels like the safest one subscription pick for a lot of people. And the reason is pretty simple. It tries to do a lot of things inside one front door. Writing, voice, research, brainstorming, images, coding, general problem solving. That matters, because a lot of people do not have one clean use case. Their work is messy, normal messy. You write for a bit, then you research, then you debug something, then you talk through an idea, then you go back and rewrite. Then maybe you need a chart or an image or a better outline. That kind of person usually does not want the best specialist for every single task. They want the tool that can catch the most tasks before they have to switch. That's where ChatGPT still makes the most sense. And I've felt that myself.
A lot of the time, the real value is that it is not always the deepest. It's that it gets you unstuck fast, especially with quick scripts, small prototypes, rough first drafts, or messy problem solving where you just need a strong first pass without a lot of friction. That is a real strength. Now, to be fair, it has weaknesses. If your work is very writing-heavy, very tone-sensitive, or very document-heavy, ChatGPT can start sounding a little too polished, a little too clean, a little too robot in a blazer. And if you're working across larger code bases or more context-heavy tasks, it is not always the one I'd trust most. So who is ChatGPT for? If your tasks are mixed, if your workflow is all over the place, and if you want one paid AI that can do a lot of things reasonably well, ChatGPT is probably the safest pick. Now, here's the obvious question. If ChatGPT is that flexible, why does it still so often sound like a machine that went to business school? That's where Claude comes in. And yeah, I know people say this all the time. Claude feels more human. That's true, but I think the more useful way to say it is this. Claude starts making a lot more sense the moment your work becomes writing-heavy, revision-heavy, document-heavy, or context-heavy. This is where the difference shows up fast. Longer discussions, better rhythm, better sentence-level taste. It tends to know when to stop. It tends to know when not to oversell. And when you're writing scripts, editing copy, reworking long paragraphs, or trying to make something sound less like AI and more like a person, that matters a lot. I've run into this enough times now that I trust Claude more when voice really matters. Not because it's magic, not because it's perfect, just because its editorial instincts are usually better. And if you work with source material, the gap gets even easier to feel. Long PDFs, notes, research, big, messy documents, stuff you need the model to actually hold on to without losing the thread 5 minutes later. That is very much Claude territory. The pricing structure kind of tells the same story. Again, prices vary by country, so treat the US numbers as examples, not universal truth. But in the US, Claude Pro sits right in that $20 zone on monthly billing, drops a bit if you pay annually, and then Max moves much higher.
Which is Anthropic's way of saying casual users and heavy users are not playing the same game here. So if I had to describe Claude in one line, I'd put it like this. Claude is less of a general-purpose machine and more of a writing and document system with unusually strong editorial instincts. So who is Claude for? Writers, script people, researchers, people revising long drafts, people working with source material, people who care a lot about tone, rhythm, clarity, and sounding like an actual human being. If that's your world, Claude makes a lot of sense. Now, Gemini gets misunderstood in a different way. People say, well, it's Google. And yeah, obviously, but that by itself doesn't really explain anything. If I had to describe Gemini in one line, I'd say this. Gemini makes the most sense when the job is not just chatting. It makes sense when the job is thinking across a giant pile of stuff. That is where Gemini starts to feel different. Because its real strength is not just that it answers questions, it's that it is clearly being built as part of a much bigger ecosystem. Gmail, Docs, Chrome, Notebook LM, Google Search Logic, Google Workflow Logic. That whole stack matters. And once you look at Gemini that way, the product starts making a lot more sense. Its superpower is not just, here is your answer. Its superpower is more like, throw me a bunch of context and let's work across all of it. That's why Gemini gets interesting for research-heavy people, people doing strategy, people doing competitor mapping, people doing topic clustering, people working across notes, links, documents, images, and giant context windows. That's also why the pricing structure matters, but with one important caveat. Pricing can vary by country and it changes, so the current plan page matters more than any single video ever will. Still, the structure tells you a lot. In the US, Google gives you a lower first paid step than the other two, then a pro tier around that familiar $20 range, and then a much higher ultra tier above that. So the message is pretty obvious.
Google wants an easy on-ramp, but it also wants a serious ladder for people doing heavier work. Now, to be fair, Gemini has its own weirdness. It can be brilliant. It can also be a little too eager to please, like it really wants to congratulate you for a draft that absolutely did not deserve applause. So, no, I would not call Gemini the best pure writing editor, but that's not really the point. So, who is Gemini for? If you already live in the Google ecosystem, if you do a lot of research, if you work with huge context, or if your workflow involves a lot of information across different formats, Gemini makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let me save you some time. If you're choosing purely on sticker price, the spread is wider than some people think. But if you're choosing based on actual fit, the answer gets clearer. ChatGPT is the safest general pick. Claude is the best fit for writing, scripts, long docs, and revision-heavy work. Gemini is the strongest fit for Google native workflows, research, and large context tasks. That's the cleanest version. And honestly, that's probably the most useful version too, because the cheaper-looking option is not automatically the better deal, not if it's wrong for your workflow. I think that's where people mess this up. They compare prices before they compare jobs, and that is backwards. If your work is mixed, go ChatGPT. If your work is mostly writing, rewriting, editing, or working with long source material, go Claude. If your work is research-heavy, Google-heavy, or context-heavy, go Gemini. That's it. You can dress it up with better metaphors if you want. Engineer, writer, strategist. Sure, those labels work, but the practical version is more useful. ChatGPT is for messy generalists. Claude is for people who live in language. Gemini is for people who think across systems and research. Now, if you're just a casual user, you can probably ignore this part. But if AI is becoming part of your daily work, this is where the next level begins. Because there's one more distinction that people blur together all the time. A web subscription, an API, and a power user workflow are not the same thing. A web subscription buys you the wrapper, the app, the interface, the chat box, the built-in tools, the plan limits. An API is different. That buys you model access as a building block. That is a different layer. And once you understand that, you stop asking only, which chatbot should I subscribe to, and start asking, which parts of my workflow should even live inside a chatbot? That is a much better question. Because for high-frequency users, developers, automation people, and people building real workflows, the long-term answer is often not more browser tabs. It is more control, more routing, more intentional use. So who is the API path for? High-frequency users, automation users, developers, people building tools, people who are tired of paying for the wrapper when what they really want is control over the engine. For everyone else, the web apps are fine. Just don't expect one tool to be perfect at everything. The smarter move is division of labor. So if I had to reduce the whole thing down to one line each, I'd put it like this. ChatGPT is the engineer. Claude is the writer. Gemini is the strategist. That's still the cleanest mental model I've found. Not because it explains everything, but because it gets you close enough to make a smart decision. And if your budget is tight, the real question is not which AI is best, it's which one actually fits the work you do most. That's the question that saves money. That's the question that saves time. And honestly, that's probably the one most people should have asked first. So now I'm curious, which one are you actually paying for right now? And after using it for a while, do you still think you bought the right version?